This is a story about a Roman soldier called Pontius Pilate, and his wife called Mrs. Pilate, and her serving girl called, well, we'll get to that. Mrs. Pilate called her husband the VIP, which stands for Very Important Pilate. This is because Pilate was in charge of a country called Judea. The people in Judea didn't like the Romans. They called him Very Ignorant Pilate or Very Irritating Pilate. Not out loud, of course. Anyone saying things like that about the Romans would get in trouble. A lot of the people wanted the Romans to go. That's why each year Pilate, his wife, and all their servants travelled to Jerusalem for a festival called Passover. Pilate had to be there in case there was trouble. Mrs. Pilate didn't like Jerusalem. She would rather stay home and have her selfie painted. "I hate the place," she shouted to her serving girl, "and everyone there hates us." Then she turned to her serving girl. "Finish my packing," she yelled. "You're so useless." And that, sadly, is the name that Mrs. Pilate called her serving girl. She called her useless. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl was very excited. She'd never been to Jerusalem before. It was really crowded. The Roman troops hit and pushed and shoved people out of the way. They were very rough, but no one could say anything because nobody wanted to get into trouble. Then Mrs. Pilate's serving girl heard something. In the distance, she could hear people in another part of the city shouting, "Hosanna!" "Is somebody important arriving?" she asked. "Don't be stupid," snapped Mrs. Pilate. "We're the only important people arriving today." Eventually, they arrived at the old king's palace, where VIP stayed when in Jerusalem. "Everyone stay inside," he ordered. "Don't draw attention to yourself. It might cause trouble." "Well, there's nowhere to go in this dump anyway," said Mrs. Pilate. "I'm going to sleep." But Mrs. Pilate couldn't sleep. "I had a really bad night," she shouted. "My bed is too lumpy." She was so angry, she picked up a vase of roses and threw them at the wall. "Useless," she said to her serving girl. "Go and get something soft to pad my mattress with." "But Master Pilate told us to stay inside," said Mrs. Pilate's serving girl, "and not to draw attention to ourselves." "Oh, don't be so useless," shouted her mistress, "as if anyone would pay any attention to you. You're a nobody, just a slave girl." So Mrs. Pilate's serving girl ran through the palace, slipped out through a little side door, and went to the market. It was really crowded. She felt quite lost. Then she saw another servant girl just like herself. "Excuse me," she said, "do you know where I could get something soft to stuff a mattress?" "Follow me," said the girl. She took Mrs. Pilate's serving girl to a stall selling straw. "Is this good straw?" asked Mrs. Pilate's serving girl. The man looked around carefully. "This," he said, "is the straw that feeds the Messiah's donkey." "The what?" asked Mrs. Pilate's serving girl. "The Messiah," whispered the man. "He came in yesterday and borrowed my donkey. Think of that! The Messiah is here and he rode my donkey." He was so happy, he gave Mrs. Pilate's serving girl a bag of straw for free. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl didn't understand why he was whispering. But she took the straw, rushed back to the palace, and stuffed it into Mrs. Pilate's mattress. "There," she said, "I hope Mrs. Pilate sleeps well." She didn't. "I had another bad night," said Mrs. Pilate. "The mattress was okay, but my bedroom is too light." Angrily, she threw another vase at the wall. "Useless! Do something about it! Go and get me something to cover the windows." So once again, Mrs. Pilate's serving girl went to the market. And who should she see but the girl who helped her yesterday? "I need something to cover a window," she said. "Follow me," said the girl. And she took Mrs. Pilate's serving girl to a man who was selling a mat. "This used to be my begging mat," said the man, "but I don't need it now Jesus has healed me." "Who?" asked Mrs. Pilate's serving girl. "Jesus," said the man. He looked around carefully. "I think he's the Messiah, the one who will kick out the Romans." "Shh," said Mrs. Pilate's serving girl nervously. "Talk like that could get you into trouble." Hurriedly, she took the mat, rushed back to the palace and put it up over the window. "There," she said. "I hope Mrs. Pilate sleeps well tonight." She didn't. I had a really bad night, said Mrs. Pilate, and she smashed 2 vases of roses. Now the room is too dark. Useless. Get me some more lamps. So Mrs. Pilate's serving girl went out to the marketplace again. And who should she see but the girl who'd helped her before? I need some light, she said. Follow me, said the girl. She took Mrs. Pilate's serving girl to a man selling lamps. I gave some to the Messiah once, he said quietly. Imagine that. The light of the world using my lamps. Why is everyone so excited about the Messiah, she asked. Because he's here, whispered the man. And don't tell the Romans, but lots of us have decided to follow him. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl quickly bought some lamps and hurried away. She wanted to find out more, but she was scared of getting into trouble. There, she said as she put the lamps in Mrs. Pilate's room. I hope Mrs. Pilate sleeps well tonight. She didn't. I had a really bad night, she yelled. The lamps made it too hot. And she smashed the rest of the vases just to show how tired she was. Useless! I'm so thirsty. I've drunk all my wine. Go and get me some more. So Mrs. Pilate's serving girl slipped out of the palace and went to the market. And, of course, she saw her friend from before. I need some wine, said Mrs. Pilate's serving girl. Follow me, said her friend. And she took Mrs. Pilate's serving girl to a woman selling bread and wine. This is the last jug, she said. Those Galileans came and bought all my bread and wine for a meal. She bent down close. They said the Messiah wanted it, she whispered. So maybe today is the day when everything changes. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl took the wine and nervously backed away. It felt like there was a storm brewing, like there was going to be trouble. She rushed back and put the wine in Mrs. Pilate's room. There, she said, I hope Mrs. Pilate sleeps well tonight. She didn't. Mrs. Pilate had a really bad night. But this time Mrs. Pilate wasn't shouting. She seemed scared. It was very early and there was a cock crowing somewhere. You must help me, Mrs. Pilate whispered. I've had this terrible dream all week. She gave a scrap of paper to the serving girl. Take this to VIP, she said. Tell him that Jesus is innocent. Find out what happens. So Mrs. Pilate's serving girl ran to the great chamber. It was very crowded, but no one took any notice of her as she pushed her way through. And then she saw him, standing in front of Pilate. She knew it was Jesus, the man everyone was talking about. But he didn't look like someone who could beat the Romans. In fact, he looked badly hurt. She managed to get right up to VIP. I've got a message from Mrs. Pilate, she said, and handed him the message. But he just looked at it and put it to one side. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl didn't know what to do. Everyone seemed very angry, but Jesus just stood there, quiet and still. Outside, the crowd was shouting. I don't want any trouble, said Pilate. He turned to the guards and said, Take him away. The guards grabbed Jesus and dragged him out of the hall. I've got to follow, thought Mrs. Pilate's serving girl. I've got to find out what happens. It took a long time for her to get out of the palace and make her way through the crowds. She didn't know where she was going, but eventually she came to the place where they had taken Jesus. And there was her friend from the marketplace. She was standing with a group of older women, and she was crying. And Mrs. Pilate's serving girl looked up and saw what had happened. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl had a really bad night. All she could think about was what she'd seen. She thought about her friend from the marketplace. She thought about the man on the cross. She couldn't understand what it was that he'd done wrong. Mrs. Pilate, on the other hand, slept and slept and slept and stayed in bed all day, and the servants replaced all the roses in her room. Mrs. Pilate's serving girl went out. It was the Passover, the big Jewish festival. It was very quiet. There wasn't any trouble. And there she saw her friend. You were there, said Mrs. Pilate's servant girl. "You were one of his followers." Her friend nodded. "I couldn't tell you because you come from the palace," she said. "But all the people we've met were his followers. And now everyone is in hiding." She looked sad. "We thought he was the one to save us," she said. "I've been buying spices for his body, and tomorrow we're going to go to the tomb and make it smell better." "I'll come as well," said Mrs. Pilate's servant girl. "You might get in trouble," said her friend. "I know, but it feels like something I have to do." The next day, Mrs. Pilate's servant girl rose early. She thought about taking something to make the tomb smell better, so she grabbed all the roses from all the vases and went to the graveyard. But when she arrived, her friend and the other women were running around in excitement. The huge stone which had sealed the tomb was lying on the ground. "What's happened?" asked Mrs. Pilate's servant girl. "He's alive," said her friend. "He's risen." "But that's impossible." "I know, but he told us he would do it, and he was always doing the impossible. We're going to tell the others." She turned to Mrs. Pilate's servant girl. "Follow him," she said. "Join us. You've seen him." "But I'll get in trouble. I'll be hunted, an escaped slave." "We'll hide you," replied her friend. "We'll give you a new life and a new name." "A new life and a new name," said Mrs. Pilate's servant girl. "You mean I won't be useless anymore?" "Oh, you've never been useless," replied her friend. "You've always been special." She looked at the flowers that Mrs. Pilate's servant girl was holding. "We'll call you Rose," she said. And that's what happened. From that day forward, Rose joined the others and followed Jesus. But she had to go into hiding in case she got into trouble. And Mrs. Pilate? She sometimes wondered what happened to her serving girl, but she never wondered for long, because the girl was quite useless anyway.